So in yesterday's web dev tip, we gave the user a choice on the front end as to where the end user gets sent to when they consume the short URL, but we didn't actually do anything with the API. So we're sending this value to the back end when we're actually creating a new short URL, but we're not actually doing anything with that. And we're going to break that into two parts. And in this video, what we're going to do is just accept the payload, the value that's being sent with the post request, and make sure that gets written into the database safely. So we're going to do that by checking the URL that's passed in from the front end with our allowed URLs in our common definitions package. And if that isn't supplied, or it's something that doesn't match, then obviously we will default to the standard URL that we want to redirect to. So let's head on over to the code in the API. This is the short URL that we're posting to. So you can see at the moment we're just generating an ID and a URL property and writing that into the database. So we need to check the payload that's coming in and then write the target, the selected value that we saw in the post request a second ago, into the database too. So there's a few things that we need to do for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be a bit explicit about the code that I'm using here, just so you can really understand as to what we're trying to do. So there's a property on the request object that comes into this function here called body. So we can say body is equal to request.body, just to get a local copy of that. Or we could use some destructuring as well. If we just do something like this, it does the same thing, but it's a little bit neater. And on this body object, what you'll find is all of the payload properties that have been passed in from the front end. So we should be able to, again using destructuring, be able to get the selected target value, which, if you remember from the front end here, this is the property that we're passing in with the value of the URL that the user selected. So we can just destructure that from the body. And if we were just to console.log that out for the moment, so we'll say selected target, and then that selected target value variable, what you'll find is that will be undefined, and I'll explain why in just a second, but just to demonstrate that for you. So if you just create another rickroll URL there, you can see we're passing in that selected target value in the payload, but the selected target down here on the console is undefined. And there's two reasons for that. We first of all need to make sure that Express is set up to accept JSON data, and we can do that in the API. And there is something that I forgot to do yesterday, which is to basically set a request header in the front-end app as well to say that we're sending JSON data too. So back over here in the main.ts file where we're setting up our Express app, here we're using cores and so forth like that, we can say app.use express.json. And that will make sure that Express parses that body property that's it receives in that function as JSON data. But you'll see that still doesn't actually work. So if we create another rickroll and look at the actual short URL headers that we're sending, so this is from the front end fetch request we're using. You can see the request headers down here. The content type is text plain, and we want it to be application JSON. So we need to fix that in the front end. As I say, should have done this yesterday really, but I just forgot. So over here, back in the app, we've got main.ts. So here, where we're actually creating this fetch request here, we want to set some headers as well. So yesterday we passed in the body. So we just need to set a headers property, and we can pass in an object to this where the key is the header name and the value of the property is actually the value that we want to set for the header. So we want to set content type to be application JSON. And with other networking tools, I believe Axios does this kind of thing for you automatically, but for some reason with the fetch request, if you are sending a post request with some JSON, you need to be fairly explicit and say that this is the type of data that you're sending. So now if we go back and create a short URL one final time from our app here, just see that here, you should see that the request header is now application JSON, and back in our terminal you can see now the selected target, the output from that console log there is now showing us the URL that the user selected. So that's just a bit of setup for what we actually need to do, which is to take that selected target value and check that it's actually in our allowed URLs. So we'll do that by just doing a simple if statement here. There's a couple of different ways you could do it, but as I say, I'm trying to just be explicit to just exactly show you what's going on here. So the first thing we need to do actually is to get a list of the URLs that we can accept that have been passed in. So we do have our allowed URLs defined in our common definitions, but don't forget they're objects. They've got like the URL and the title as well. So we want to say the allowed URL strings, for example, and we'll just take the allowed URLs and map them. And for each URL, we'll just say allowed URL, and we'll just pick out the URL, which is the string of where the user is allowed to be sent to. So that'll just be a list of strings now, and so we can check that the selected target value actually exists in that allowed value of strings. So we could say something like allowed URL strings dot includes the selected target value. So if that's true, then we've got a good URL that's been passed in. We're allowed to actually insert that into the database. But if not, what we'll do is we'll just set a default value to pass in instead. So I'll just define a temporary variable up here called target, which will just be a string. Oops. And if the selected target value is allowed, we'll just set that target value to the selected target value, because we know it's a good URL that's been passed in. But if not, we'll just basically grab the allowed URL strings, and we'll just grab the first one out of there. So we're just using a default value essentially there. And one other thing as well, the selected target value property may not be on the request if the user's trying to be malicious, or we're just forgetting to send it for some reason in our app. So I'll just set a default value if that property doesn't exist in the body, which will obviously fail this if statement and put the default value in there. So all we need to do now really is in our payload that we're putting into the database, we'll just set the target in there as well. So I'm just going to use the ES6 shorthand property notation for that. So what we should find is when we create a new short URL now, we should see that the target property is inserted as well. So let's head back on over to our app. Let's just tidy things up here. So let's just make sure we're choosing a different video. And if we click create rickroll and look at the response that we're getting back from the database, or from the API that's calling the database, you can see now we've got this target property in there, and we should find that this target URL here is something different from the original video that we were choosing to send the user to. So that's showing that we've got a different video than the original one. So let's just check that default value is being inserted into the database as well. So let's create another post request here. And you can see here, because we're not sending any body, we're just sending an empty post request, we should find that we're defaulting to this original video, which was that's the YouTube video that we were originally sending the users to in the API. So we're setting that target appropriately. And also if we do try and set something in the JSON payload as well, so we can, if someone's trying to be a bit malicious and saying selected target value, I think that was the property name, wasn't it? Yeah, that's right, is equal to somewhere else, so example.com, maybe they were trying to send someone to there, and we don't want to allow them to do that. We can click send, and we should find that it just defaults to that same video. It doesn't actually write that URL into the target, so we're restricting the user's access to only send people to the target that we want to. So that's set up and working pretty much as we'd expect it to. The next step is to work on the redirect and to actually pick out that target property, so that when the end user that's consuming the short URL actually uses the URL, they actually follow this target value rather than the hard-coded video link that we've got in our app at the moment. So that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.